Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me all right. Please bear with us as we navigate this new quarantine communication system together. My name is Tyler Kibbey, and while there will probably still be some participants joining us throughout, we're going to go ahead and get introduction. So first of all, thank you for attending the webinar today. This has been an ongoing collaborative effort, and some of these presentations were intended for this year's American Dialect Society, but luckily we had this already planned in advance, so we can still carry out this work in quarantine together. So thank you for being here again. There we go. So first, on behalf of all the panelists, I would like to offer a collective land acknowledgement. So first, I would like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that we are on the lands of Cherokee and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to forced removal. These lands continue to carry the story of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. For Bryce, this work was carried out on stolen land at an institution that benefits economically from the continued destruction of indigenous sovereignty. Specifically, this project was finished on land in the unceded territory of the Osage and the Wichita nations. On behalf of Brent, this research was conducted on stolen land. It was made possible through the continued occupation and exploitation of native land. The parts of Kentucky and West Virginia where this research was conducted belong to the Cherokee and Shawnee people. On behalf of Jarrett, I acknowledge that I am in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish, Kootenai, and Kalispel people. The University of Montana and I honor the path they have always shown us in caring for this place for generations to come. And on behalf of the University of Kentucky, whose linguistics department is co-sponsoring this panel, as a land-grant institution, the University of Kentucky has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. So this panel, Approaching a Queer Dialectology, is co-sponsored by the University of Kentucky's Linguistics Department, as well as the Linguistic Society of America's Committee on LGBTQ Issues in Linguistics. My name is Tyler Kibbey. I am currently a postgraduate research fellow at the University of Humboldt in Berlin, and the current chair of the Committee on LGBTQ Issues in Linguistics. Bryce McCleary is a recent PhD in Oklahoma State University. Brent Watts is a linguist and playwright from Beaufort County in Eastern Kentucky and is a recent graduate of the University of Kentucky's MA in Linguistic Theory and Psychology program. And Jarrett Hopewell is currently finishing his master's in linguistics at the University of Montana. So thank you for joining us. To start off, I'm going to give a brief commentary to sort of frame the conversations that were happening around the time this panel began to emerge as a topic that we wish to pursue in a much broader format. So briefly, I want to talk about the rootedness metric in the work of Paul Reed, and specifically my engagement with it over the past 6 years. As a fellow Tennessean, like Paul Reed, but unlike Paul Reed, a queer Tennessean who engages with this concept. So when we're thinking about dialectology linguistics, especially for some of us, including the panelists who are out there from Appalachia, linguistics as a discipline is disproportionately underrepresented in the region. In my home state of Tennessee, for instance, the closest thing to a bachelor's degree in linguistics is at the University of Tennessee, and it's actually a concentration in a interdisciplinary studies department. And this is where I received my bachelor's in quote unquote linguistics. It's also, Tennessee as a state is one of the few states that has specifically defunded LGBTQ initiatives, specifically for language issues. So in 2016, the Tennessee defunded the University of Tennessee's Pride Center for the promotion, quote unquote, promotion of gender-neutral pronouns. For rootedness for me, and when we're thinking about sociolinguistics, dialectology, and allied subfields and areas of inquiry, respectively, rootedness for me stands out as something that has really appealed to me as as a cultural concept, as a fellow Tennessean linguist trying to consider and think about where queer linguists can find a place in these fields. So briefly, I was first introduced to the idea in 2014. I attended Paul Reed's lecture for the Eastern Tennessee Historical Society that year. And I walked away thinking about rootedness and his conception of a measurement for place attachment and the degree of local identity. And I remember thinking that this was a fantastic idea, and as a Tennessean, this appealed to me in a very exceptional way. And going through my family and thinking, oh, this would definitely be cool to apply to my cousins, my uncles, my aunts, my relatives, and going down all the list of all the heterosexual members of my family. But then when I got to myself and thinking about how my own language practices and how this could be potentially applied to someone like me, I found that the concept was not inherently wrong, but somewhat unintelligible to who I was, both as a member of a queer community in that same cultural context, but also as a linguist who would be undertaking those activities or this research initiative. So for Paul Reed's rootedness metric, and I'll keep this brief to give time for Q&A, but also to avoid the appearance of derailing into polemic. The rootedness metric broadly involves a survey of categories, specifically the willingness to relocate, travel habits, where a participant claims to be from, family history, areal identification, how much they participate in local events, and self-reported strength of local identity. However, as a queer linguist, I was initially struck on that first day after being introduced to it, but also thinking about it for the next 6 years, that some of these categories and the way that the very concept approaches place attachment was not legible to my experience within that same community. So Paul Reed is from a county along the northern border of Tennessee. I'm also from a county along the northern border of Tennessee. We're only, I think, 6 counties apart. But what struck me was that this concept of rootedness, while especially appropriate perhaps for the community that he was working in, is something that I don't believe that within my own work as a queer linguist I could have ever arrived at, specifically because of my own experiences within similar cultural. So for instance, of those categories, a willingness to relocate, travel habits, participation in local events, and self-reported strength of local identity are more or less unintelligible to some, especially rural, queer identities. And so the problem for me when thinking about this over the years has not been that it's scientifically unsound or unempirical, but rather what one linguist would perceive as rootedness, another, such as someone coming from the queer community, might understand a person's relationship with place as a pressure to move away from somewhere, and whether or not that pressure maybe exceeds a certain limit, and that causes some sort of social reaction. Of course, there's also the issues of performance. When you're in certain environments, especially in a rural home community, you're not necessarily performing a place attachment as much as you are trying to disguise yourself and from the potential of hate crimes, essentially. And I don't want to spend too much on this. I will be talking about this at length in another panel next week for the Brazilian Linguistics Association. But I would like to introduce this here at the beginning and the onset of this panel to sort of frame why this is important and why we should be thinking about queer dialectology is not simply a reaction to dialectology proper, but as a extension and full realization of dialectology with, for, and by queer and trans linguists. But also as a discipline and as a subfield, we need to be conscious that we need to move towards more proactive and long-term structural changes, both for the queer and trans communities in the regions that we conduct research in, but also in our own disciplinary communities, including, but not limited to administrative decentralization, funding initiatives for this kind of research, a promotion of anti-inter and multidisciplinary research practices, but also providing auxiliary training for academic and science management and public policy engagement that queer and trans linguists are disproportionately denied access to in the traditional academy. So what we hope to do here in this panel is to introduce and sort of re-examine popular approaches to the study of language variation, specifically looking at perceptual dialectology and the concept of a region. So in many ways, these talks address regions in ways that complicate typical about them, including through social media, through the community, and also through intersections of regional and gender identity and expression. Bryce McCleary, I introduced earlier, he will be giving a talk immediately after me entitled Queer Folk Linguistics, Language Regard, and Intersectional Identity. Brent Watts will be giving a talk on The Man, the Moth, the Legend, the role and function of folklore in queer Appalachian social media communities. And Jarrett Hopewell will be giving a talk titled Growls and Woofs, a theoretical and descriptive analysis of conceptual animal metaphors in queer speech. As a final note, we will have about 20 minutes for Q&A at the end of the panel. Please hang around until then, but feel free throughout the panel to type your questions into the Q&A chat, and then we can go through them at the end. This webinar is also going to be recorded, so be mindful of that. And these slides and the recording will be made available following the webinar. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Bryce.
All right. Hi, everybody. So I am Bryce, and Bryce needs Tyler to help me be able to share my screen because it is currently disabled. Well, while we're waiting for that to be figured out, I'm Bryce McCleary, and as a reminder, I'm a recent PhD graduate from Oklahoma State University. This project that I'm going to be talking to you about is actually from my dissertation. Surprise, surprise. And that dissertation project has been on looking at a community of drag performers in Oklahoma City. So it began in 2016, and it started with about 3 years of observations and conversations. I should note that this is Oklahoma, for those of you who maybe don't know or have never known where Oklahoma is. And here is a map of Oklahoma. There's Oklahoma City. And that star represents an area called the Gayborhood by local drag performers and people who go here. So this project namely worked with or observed and talked to people who are engaged in the drag community, who perform here regularly at venues, all the way from new aspiring performers who are just on the scene, including one particular venue for 18 and up performers and queer people. I won't talk much about that, but I'm happy to answer more questions about that later. Largely, these performers and community members were asked questions about what they felt about language. That is, their ideas of how language works in the community, what role it plays, and how language has a sort of tie to drag performance. So 2 years of interviewing and recording followed after the development of an interview questions or discussion group questions. And today's talk is going to cover the responses of 7 participants, about 6.5 hours of speech data, and there's some structural stuff I'll talk about that comes from about 25,000 words of transcribed speech. These are the performers who I'm going to be talking about today. You can see they're arranged here by the years of experience that they've had in the scene. They have a decent range of age, and I want to note that all performers were asked to offer their own labels for ethnic identity, gender identity, and their drag in a few words. That is, there was a blank spot, and they were asked to describe in their own words. And you can see there's some variation here, and I did my best to capture their own descriptions, including spelling and capitalization. So some notes on transcriptions real quick. I used typical spelling conventions, so I didn't, unless it was relevant to the discourse, there wasn't a whole lot of vernacular of spelling. I did use community spelling of some words, like community slang or in-group words. It does employ intonation units. They're marked by, the end of intonation units are marked by commas. Noises such as laughter, sighing, and clapping are indicated by double parentheses, and quotative performatives are indicated by bracketed cues with italicized speech. I also want to offer a trigger warning that there will be explicit language in these speech samples, but if any of you know anything about drag, that should hardly be surprising to you. I should mention that we should talk a little bit about language regard before I get started on this, since this is a queer folk linguistics study. And language regard or folk linguistics really has its start, at least as far back as we can start citing it, before this citation here, even in early work in perceptual dialectological stuff in Europe. But the first time we really see folk linguistics being talked about specifically was Honigswald's proposal for it at the 1965 UCLA Conference for Sociolinguistics. And at that conference, William Labov notes that, well, okay, I've heard people and talked to people who can hear really nasalized speech and really denasalized speech. And in both cases, non-linguists will refer to that speech as nasal. And Labov points out that maybe non-linguists haven't had, well, we know non-linguists haven't had the kinds of specific training that linguists have, right? So there's some things that sort of fly under the radar that people aren't necessarily aware of. But actually later on, Preston points out that what if non-linguists are actually remarking on a perceived inappropriate level of nasality? And so nasal in that case actually fits quite well for the sort of phenomena that they're noticing. And the only difference that we're talking about here is a folk vocabulary versus a technical vocabulary that linguists have, and that they might actually understand a great deal of language. So I want to move on from here to say that briefly that, oh, how do I make my little chat thing go away? That folk linguistics came out of this sort of noticing this pattern for non-linguists to have, well, deserve more credit than they're often given. And a lot of the early work on this focused on meta-language and language attitudes, more explicit type of data. But more recently, folk linguistics and studies in language regard have been interested in presupposition and implicata. We'll be covering both today. So one of the questions asked of these respondents was, is there such a thing as a drag style of speech? And here's Giselle.
I definitely say there is. There's I feel like that we have a code, and a lot of people wouldn't understand it sometimes.
This notion that a drag style of speech brings up this idea of a code is ubiquitous across this group. Drag slang, drag code, in-group language use, it's very common in response to this particular question. We're actually going to come back to Giselle because she has a even more nuanced a description of this or contribution to this response, but we'll come back to it. So when asked this, these words are very commonly what are offered when asked about a drag style of speech. People talk about a code, they talk about slang, and they use these sort of words that, that might be familiar to you or might be unfamiliar to you. But what's interesting is when I looked at that set of transcripts I told you about 25,000 words, I found that they were all used not only as explicit examples of drag slang or drag styles of speech, but in usage as well. That is, these performers are actually using this language and they're aware of it and able to address it. But what I found most interesting is that the word bitch occurs more than any of the others. And I don't think that anyone would necessarily think of bitch as being a word that solely belongs to drag communities, let alone a small drag community in Oklahoma City. However, there's something worth noting here. That is, if you look at the kinds of, or the ways or discourse functions of bitch that, in this data, you see it used nominatively, which I think that we could probably expect, and vocatively, which we might also expect. But there's this interesting use of self-reference. So, for example, Ray here says, how you doing, child? Yes, get turns up, get a drink, be yourself, and tip a bitch. And Ray is not, encouraging you to be philanthropic. She's actually saying, tip me. Foxy, for example, also says, a bitch don't know no country by heart, meaning I don't know any country by heart. But there's some other uses of bitch in this community, namely one of a discourse marker. Foxy, for example, says, bitch, I couldn't lip sync to save my life, bitch. If that show was back then, bitch, I'm sure would have left because, bitch, I couldn't lip sync for my life. And Giselle says, I can do it in so many ways. You just learned the news, bitch. And the interesting thing about Giselle here is it's not quite the same as Foxy. Notice that Foxy's usage of bitch here is actually sort of being used to maintain the floor, like a discourse marker. And Giselle's sort of expression bitch here also carries with it a lengthened vowel, some breathy voice quality. So there's some interesting things happening here in this community that performers are actually quite aware of. And the semantic and functional variability may confuse some. For example, Gwen says bitch is an enigma. But the awareness of this kind of variability in this group actually emerges quite explicitly from language regard data. For example, here's Foxy.
There's so many words that can mean the exact same thing. I mean, so many different terms can mean one thing. And then the way you say it could.
Oh, so sorry. The way you say it could mean something else, or a derogatory phrase, or common or rude statement. I think that one important thing to take away from that is that Foxy, although she's offering a sort of, quick, casual response to that, is addressing some pretty complex and nuanced language matters. That is, she's aware of drag slang. She's brought it up and talked about terminologies that are used. She talks about how some of those things can mean the same thing, they share meaning, but that they're different in different contexts. That's polysemy, semantic variability. And she's completely aware of it, and even goes on to offer some sort of examples of this. So this actually is quite interesting, because if we look at the trends for this sort of responses to is there such a thing as a drag style of speech, we of course are interested in the presuppositions and the implicata in the responses to those questions, but we should also care about the presuppositions or implications within the question itself. So to some extent, this question, it seems to be encouraging thinking about a drag style of anything, or perhaps a drag language connection. And that seems to motivate a thinking about slang and a thinking about particular lexical items or phrases. I think to describe it like that is actually not to do justice to the complexity with which these respondents are actually talking about such things. It's just that we're getting a clear and very visible, explicit type of regard. A second question that was asked directly following this question was, what does it mean to talk like a drag queen? And we might hypothesize that this carries some presuppositions like, okay, drag queens can talk in a certain way, or you can talk like any kind of category, or that maybe it implies a drag queen and language connection. And so this might require us to look for a little more implicit data, or more implicit ideas or ideologies coming through the data. So when Kelly was asked this, she actually said, oh, you got to lie a lot. How wonderful everything is, how comfortable you are, this old thing, when drag performers spend thousands of dollars on outfits, or, does it hurt to dance in heels? No, I dance in these all the time when your feet are dying inside. And the interesting that's happening here is the only real explicit language issue or language phenomenon that Kelly is addressing is lying. But the examples that she gives are really sort of hinting that performance matters a great deal in drag. That is, when you're performing on stage, when you're performing in a number, or you're hosting at a club, you have to commit to a character, and you have to go along with that character and feed off of the audience. And we can see that, at least in a sort of peripheral way, that Kelly is offering an idea that language might have a role to play in that performance. So Gwen, for example, was asked about a drag style of speech, and this sort of implicit presuppositional stuff, asked about talking about like a drag queen. And this presuppositional and implicational stuff sort of helps us parse what she says. So she says, okay, to talk like a drag queen, I mean, I don't know, I've always been gay as hell, so I guess I've always kind of talked like that. And this actually structurally creates a sort of logical link between being gay as hell and talking like a drag queen. I won't go into the data that backs this up, but I'm happy to talk about it later on. But this is actually a really, really common thing that I found both in this study and in my other work on dialectological work in Oklahoma with queer populations. That is that drag queens and drag performers are very often perceived as sort of an excessive amount of gay, or the pinnacle of gay. And the speech that they use is thought of as, one performer says, a drag queen might use every word in the gay dictionary in under 5 seconds. So this is something that is not uncommon for this particular group, but offers quite an interesting way of thinking about the ways that what it means to talk like a drag queen. Gwen goes on to say, whether it's a straight friend who has never been out before, or like someone who's new to coming out, or anything like that, you hear them say stuff and you're just kind of like, oh, that's not how you use that, girl. Like, that's not right. Like, hang on just a second. And I want to point out that this is kind of interesting, right? Because we get this sort of implication that, straight people, new people to the scene, or people who, just aren't in the community, don't know how to use our language, the language of the community, of this community of practice of drag performers. But there's also an interesting presupposition here, and that's not how you use that girl, that's not right. The presupposition being that there is a right way to use this slang. And I think that on its own, that might not seem like a very important thing to point out, but actually, if you think about it, it implies a sort of prescriptivist notion about how this language can be used or should be used. And that prescriptivist attitude or idea is not something that Gwen exhibits by herself. So just looking at these responses real quick, we've seen that drag slang, questions about drag slang or about a drag style of speech have shown us community-based lexicon, structural and phonetic variation, community-specific stylistics, explicit regard. We get awareness and beliefs about slang, the monitoring of language use, implicata and presupposition certainly show us some more nuanced or more complicated aspects to language and perceptual dialectology. However, my sociolinguist friends are probably out there asking, what about patterns across this group or the variation across this group, however small it might be? And my linguistic anthropologist friends are probably saying, well, what about identity and performance? Or what about the norms in this community of practice? And my response to that is, of course, we should all care about that. You can't do that without, to use community language, zhuzhing up the approaches that we take to studying language regard data. So what is queer folk linguistics? It's essentially, or most simplistically, the bridging of language regard and queer or sociocultural linguistics. It's a sociocultural approach to language regard data. That is what non-linguists have to say about language. But I also think that secondarily, it's a methodological supplement to research on LGBTQ populations. That is, most research on queer people already values and considers seriously queer people's own experiences with language-related prejudice, with their own preferred terms for themselves or preferred pronouns. And all of that, I think, fits quite neatly within a study of language regard, what non-linguists have to say about language. And I think that we have a way here of sophisticating this particular approach to studying such a thing. So language regard, when people express regard for language, they're always involving stance taking. And I use that in a sort of broad umbrella term for any sort of positionality or any sort of utterance being made about something, even if it's neutral. And sometimes that can include positioning or footing, which I'm using here to mean more specifically attitudinal, evaluative, or perhaps epistemic stance taking as well. And of course, that is both influenced by and influences our ways of looking at conversational context. And all of this contributes to identity, performance, linguistic practice, and ideologies and the ways that we look at that or understand them. So Alexander, for example, was asked about a drag style of speech. And in his particular response, there's some hedging. He says, I guess we have like our own little slang. There's kind of that style, there's kind of that slang. And one way of sort of wondering why Alexander is hedging so much here is probably because he is rather inexperienced. However, being inexperienced here with less than a year of experience in the scene, I want to point out, is not brand new. So Alexander has done drag and had experimented with drag before he got to the scene, but now he's been doing shows and he's been doing a few things, and it has been less than a year, but he is involved in the entertainment part of this community. He utters some meta language as well. You know, we have work, yes. We've been saying read all night, shade. I think the interesting thing here is that all of this is sort of relating to epistemic stance taking. In the case of the former two, of course, this hedging is sort of, you know, mitigating the seriousness or the surety that he has with talking about drag slang as a sort of newer person on the scene and a relatively young person considering the ages of most established performers. But notice that he also says, oh, we've been saying read all night. As sort of an example, like, you know, we use this language, we know what we're talking about. And later when he talks about learning slang, he says, you know, I'll be sitting backstage and somebody's like, oh, we're gonna run it. And it took me forever to understand that means we're not gonna be talking in between. Once I call your name, you go. And Alexander goes on to talk about how he missed his cue 3 or 4 times before he finally remembered how to remember what we're gonna run it means. And now talks about having never missed his cue and always being ready to run it because you never know what's gonna happen. So there's some credibility being sort of built here, that is that he's actually at a real show where they have a backstage, where they have a host, and where he's got to be able to run it and do these sort of things that to him sound like a very, you know, very professional, very entertainment industry related terminology. But there's also some effort that's sort of established here by Alexander's talking about how it took him forever, how he finally got it. And now he never misses his cue. So some things to take away from this that we might wonder are about, Alexander's inexperience, or perhaps, what it means for him to just getting started working in the scene, and wonder if he has something to prove. Well, I turn it now to Alexander and his drag sister, Ray.
Which a lot of these are coming out into normal speech for most everyone because of RuPaul's. But I'm tired of people comparing drag close to them to RuPaul's. So like they'll come up, they'll see one of us in drag and be like, work, and it's like, you don't even know what that means. Fuck off. Thank you. Bye.
If you don't know the slur, don't say it. Okay. Just rewind it again. If you don't know the slur, do not say it.
Say it again for the people in the back.
If you don't know the slur, do not say it.
So this is one of my favorite excerpts because Ray and Alexander, although relatively inexperienced compared to some of the other members of or other respondents in this particular study, clearly have the entertainment side of this down. Halfway through this discussion, they switched to a sort of performative discussion of something that looks quite a bit like that sort of prescriptivism that we saw in Gwen's response. And this isn't something that is unique to these three. However, they certainly exhibit it more in this set of respondents than anyone else. That is that these three are three of the four rather inexperienced performers, and they all exhibit here and there ideas about policing in-group language or making sure that people are using it right and not using it wrong. I'll note that Celeste does not engage in this kind of prescriptivist activity, but she also is frankly one of the most timid drag queens I've ever met in my life, and also is a bit older than her peers and is sort of more hesitant about engaging with this sort of cultural or sociocultural phenomena. So I want to bring back that queer folk linguistics borrows from queer linguistics the idea that identity and practice are tied, that there's a relationship between them. And if we think about what language regard is, that is anyone's utterance about their ideas about language, their reactions to language, whether that is neutral, whether it's evaluative or effective, all of that involves stance taking. It can involve footing and positioning. And when you think about what that means in a study like this, when we're talking about language as it relates to being involved in a drag community where everyone has a role to play and a relationship with other people in this community, then it is inevitably work being done towards identity construction, which of course contributes to broader themes of identity and how linguistic practices are related to that. Now, if you were going to study that, then we have to note that this can't be done without intersectionality. Borrowing from Kimberly Crenshaw's work in the intersectionality of African-American women in the United States. I think this is particularly important because so many people in this particular group of respondents are non-cisgender and non-cisgender people of color, and in a place like Oklahoma. And all of those things don't exist separately for these individuals. That this sort of unique experience of being who they are culminates in something more like Gestalt, something that means more than the sum of its parts. And it has to be considered carefully. And since I am a white and cisgender researcher, it's really important that I'm aware of this, but also ratiolinguistic approaches to this. That is, because I am inevitably going to be blinded by white privilege, and because so many performers of color are involved in this study, this is a really important thing to add to queer folk linguistics. But there's a second and equally important reason to lean on ratiolinguistics in this kind of work, and that's that drag, both broadly and in Oklahoma City, is greatly influenced by African American language and culture. And it would be a great shame to go without acknowledging that and acknowledging the sort of important ways that influences the community. So I want to point out again that Ray, Gwen, and Alexander all exhibit this sort of prescriptivist way of talking about drag language in the particular community. And if we, but before I move on, I want to note that there are other performers who are also talking about language in the community, particularly as we talk about language spread and the spread of culture vis-a-vis things like RuPaul's Drag Race and other popular cultural representations of drag. For example, here's Foxy, who has over a decade of experience.
And then, you know, TV is all about, I mean, it's universal. So, of course, there's straight people, they do, everybody watch TV. So, who have never been around them, of course, like, oh my gosh, she's so funny. I never heard that before. They're looking at us like, girl, have you heard what's her name said on the game show? I said that last night when I was drunk. Yeah. You know, I said that last night to my home. Right. You know, like, bitch.
So if we summarize what some of our performers here, respondents here, have said about drag language, Alex says, don't use our slang incorrectly. Ray says, if you don't know it, don't say it. Gwen says, that's not how you use that. But Foxy says the language on TV didn't come from TV. And that, frankly, is a different kind of, it's a criticism indeed, but it's quite a different criticism and one that I think is a bit more complex. Now, I showed you at the very beginning Giselle's comment on how that this community has their own code, their own terminologies. Here's the rest of what Giselle had to say.
I definitely say there is. There's I feel like that we have a code, and a lot of people wouldn't understand it sometimes. I think a lot of it actually comes more from Paris is Burning, and then it's spreading out into mainstream and RuPaul's Drag Race. When you see now that it's on the screens, people are seeing those words, and now they're rolling out into other communities now. And but you know what? Funny is, a lot of our slang and stuff, I think a lot of it comes from the South. Because when I was watching the Housewives of Atlanta, they say a lot of stuff, and I'm thinking, like, they got this from the gay community. And I was like, you know what's funny? I think the gay community got this from the South. I think, like, what's the tea and all that stuff? That's these Georgia peaches used to sit down and drink tea. So I think we get that a lot from Black women.
So if we review the sort of paraphrasing of what people's criticisms of language spread or the language use that's happening here, we see that Giselle's aligns more with Foxy's, that is, she's saying it's spreading through pop culture, but it came from Black women. It's important to note that there's not enough data here, at least in this presentation, to definitively say that Foxy and Giselle, being African-American performers, are influenced by their particular experience in saying this. However, because so much African-American language and culture has been borrowed and appropriated and reappropriated in queer communities, and especially in drag communities, and how that's made its way onto shows like RuPaul's Drag Race, it wouldn't be surprising, at least to me, if more seasoned performers like Foxy and Giselle were sort of accustomed to people using slang wrong, or using words wrong, or using words unlike how they would hear it otherwise, perhaps outside of this community. And in fact, maybe that might be why they're so inclined to talk about the recognition of the origin of drag slang, or the origin of where this stuff came from, and who gets to be authentically credited for being the speakers of it. Well, I think that we have to take a step away from that for just a second to talk about community roles, because intersectionality in a drag community like Oklahoma City, or a community of drag performers like Oklahoma City, has to account for drag family. That is, queer kinship systems that exist between performers. So I'll note that Gwen, unlike any other relatively inexperienced performer, says, I mean, you know, I've always been gay as hell, so I've always kind of talked like that, but, you know, you've got to use terminology and know what it means and where it comes from. She's the only performer who has relatively little experience and who is able to talk about the needing to know the origin of this. Well, drag family or queer kinship systems in drag like this typically involve a parent, mentor, or advisor who helps people or young drag performers with everything from makeup to outfits to networking to finding out how what particular styles to perform in their entertainment. For example, one drag father in this community is the father of Ray, Alexander, and Celeste. And when I actually met Alexander through another person I'd met in the community and asked him to sit down with me, he said, sure, but you can't do it without my sisters. And I said, okay, well, fair enough for me. Similarly, Foxy has had a number of drag children and used to be sisters with Giselle. Now, they still refer to each other as sisters because they're close, but Giselle left Foxy's drag family and they had previously shared a last name, for their characters, their persona. or Personi. They had shared a last name, but Giselle no longer brandishes that. Giselle for a short time was Gwen's mother, but now for the last 7 or 8 years, Foxy has been Gwen's mother. That is, Gwen has spent more time with Foxy and Giselle than probably any other performer in this community. And actually, if you think about it, this tendency for younger performers to be more prescriptive with the language use here is probably tied to their needing to establish themselves as real, valued, and participating members of the community. Similarly, though, the more seasoned performers, and particularly Foxy and Giselle, are more interested in calling out this language use being acknowledged for where it really came from. And it's no stretch of the imagination as to how Gwen's relationship and close relationship to Foxy and Giselle, as both Foxy's drag daughter and Giselle's drag niece, would affect her ability to know, or her readiness to know that it is important for such acknowledgments of where the slang came from. So I want to point out that no single demographic or category label can account for language use, variation, or experience. The intersectionality and identity span place, roles, gender, race, and other sociocultural categories. It's necessary in the consideration of sociolinguistic patterns, interpretations, and explanations. And this data is rich with language regard material, but there are really important measures to be taken in its interpretation. Finally, language regard is a worthwhile study of investigation. I think queer folk linguistics ought to or needs to situate language regard within the study of identity, and that requires sociocultural, queer, and racial-linguistic perspectives, requires sensitivity and intersectional approaches to the data. And these approaches have and can lead to a growing understanding of language use, language variation, and language ideology, centering on identity work and performance. And finally, this work in grounding the study in community leaves ample opportunity for future research, some of which is already underway. Please ask me about it. I'm happy to talk about it. Thank you very much.
Okay, next we'll have Brent Watts giving his presentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brent Watts, and I am a recent MA graduate from the Linguistics program at the University of Kentucky. And my presentation today is about the man, the moth, the legend, the role and function of folklore in queer Appalachian social media communities. I began this research with this premise. The lives and experiences of rural queer and queer Appalachian people are, generally speaking, discounted and or ignored. And that's by lay people, and that's by the academy. It's everywhere. And I think there are some misconceptions that may contribute to the discounting of queer Appalachian and rural queer people. One of those is that rural queers and queer Appalachians don't exist. Alternatively, if we do exist, there's not enough of us to matter. Or we don't differ in any way, any significant way at least, from our queer urban or our cis heteronormative rural counterparts. So basically we're one or the other, but we're not both. But really, I think what this is demonstrating the fact that queer Appalachians complicate metronormativity and the discourse of metronormativity. Metronormativity was coined by Halberstam in 2005, and it's the notion that the rural and the urban are spatially and socially opposed. And furthermore, that urban spaces are the only places for queer community and liberation, that queer existence, queer life cannot really happen in rural spaces. And with this, queer Appalachians also complicate the discourse of Appalachianness as being intrinsically tied to cis heteronormativity. So what this study consists of, actually, it's a multimodal critical discourse analysis of nearly 4 years worth of posts from the Queer Appalachia, or QA, Instagram account. I'll be talking a little bit about what and who Queer Appalachia is, but it's a community, it's a resource collective for queer Appalachians, queer Southerners, and queer rural people, mostly throughout the South and Midwest. So one thing I'm arguing about the folkloric discourse under analysis in this project is that folkloric discourse is both a substrate for and byproduct of social interactions within queer Appalachian online social media communities. So folklore has its origins, different folklores have their origins in different communities, but the folkloric discourse that's happening on queer Appalachia is constantly being reinterpreted through a queer Appalachian lens. And specifically, the specific folklore that's undergoing this especially is the Mothman. In making this argument, I identify some pretty important functions of queer Appalachian folkloric discourse. So one of those is the reconciliation and union of queerness and Appalachianness. I attribute this in part to, for one, it's necessary for a queer Appalachian existence, a happy existence, to reconcile and unify those parts of yourselves in whatever way works best. But also, I think that this is in part attributable to the reclamation of queerphobic and or anti-Appalachian discourse that positions queer people and Appalachian people as sexually deviant monsters or predators waiting to prey on cis heteronormative or urban people. And as a good example of that, see Deliverance. If you haven't seen it, you don't really need to. But that's a good example of this kind of prejudice towards queer people and Appalachian people. Another important function of the folkloric discourse on the queer Appalachian account is the promotion and advocacy of leftist praxis and anti-fascist, anti-racist, pro-queer resistance. In part, I think this is due to an attempt to claim or reclaim leftist political heritage in Appalachia. So there actually is quite a bit of history and culture tied to leftism, specifically communism in Appalachia. From the 1890s to the 1930s, the coal wars happened in parts of West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky. And what happened was the coal miners were living in company towns. They were only being paid scrip, which could only be spent at the company towns. So they, their families, and their allies armed themselves and rose up against the mine owners to effectively seize the means of production and secure their labor rights. So speaking more directly to who Queer Appalachia is, it also includes the Electric Dirt Collective, which is a zine that Queer Appalachia publishes. So this is a list of people for whom Queer Appalachia exists. So it includes granny witches, Muslim Appalachians, also Islam Appalachia, Indigenous Appalachians, Afro-Appalachians, Two-Spirit, Farm Her, Chocolate Spoonies, Dirt Princess, White Trash, White Treasure. There's a lot of people, and it's not, you may not know what some of these things mean, and that's fine. But this is an idea of who Queer Appalachia is. More specifically, they are at Queer Appalachia on Instagram. They also have a Facebook as well. It began as a memorial project for the late Bren Kelly. Her partner currently runs Queer Appalachia. Bren was a trans woman writer, artist, activist, and self-proclaimed granny witch. And following her passing, her partner began it in the Queer Appalachia project as an online community and as a resource collective for queer Appalachians and Southerners. One of the goals of the Queer Appalachia and the Electric Dirt Collective is to reclaim and redefine what it means to be queer, what it means to be Appalachian, and more specifically, what it means to be queer Appalachian. Furthermore, most of their efforts these days go towards mutual aid and harm reduction efforts throughout Appalachia and the South, specifically as it pertains to the opioid epidemic and the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases. This is a map of Appalachia. The red heart represents where I'm from in Eastern Kentucky, that's Breathitt County. And the blue heart represents Point Pleasant, where Mothman was allegedly first sighted. So this map of Appalachia is the map created by the Appalachian Regional Commission, which is a government group that was created primarily to address the war on drugs throughout Appalachia. And you see that it's kind of restrictive. I want to emphasize here that I'm not really trying to define what Appalachia is or isn't. There's Appalachian diaspora. Appalachia is as inclusive or as exclusive as it needs to be. With that said, I want to make the point, though, that Mothman is, at least by some metric, if not by virtue of being in West Virginia, Appalachian. Now, a bit about the Mothman for those who may not know. So the Mothman was first sighted in Clinton, West Virginia on November 12th, 1966. He was described as being large, hulking. He had the ability to fly. He had red glowing eyes. And then on November 15th, 1966, two young couples were out for a drive in the TNT area in Point Pleasant. Now, the TNT area used to be a government manufacturing facility for explosives. It's now a nature preserve, but the concrete igloos that they built to store the explosives are still there. And it's said that whatever they were doing there may be the cause for the Mothman. Regardless, there were two teenage couples out for a drive in this area. And they came upon the creature devouring the carcass of a German Shepherd. When their car lights came upon it, it turned around and its red eyes glowed, and it began to chase them. The couples say that it matched their speeds of 75 to 100 miles an hour. For the next year, people throughout Point Pleasant reported similar experiences until December 15th, 1967. On this day, the Silver Bridge, which connects Point Pleasant, West Virginia to Gallipolis, Ohio, collapsed, sending 46 people to their deaths. Eyewitnesses that day say that they saw the Mothman either near the bridge, flying over the bridge, or perched atop the bridge. Following that, the Mothman was never really seen again in Point Pleasant. In 1975, though, the Mothman Prophecies by John Keel was published, which was later made into a movie in 2002. In between those times, the Mothman was said to have been seen in Russia prior to the Chernobyl disaster, where he gave people nightmares and left strange phone calls. He was also said to be sighted in 1999 prior to the Russian apartment bombings in Moscow. More recently, actually, he was also sighted in 2016 and 2017 in Chicago and the Lake Michigan area, and his appearance there was attributed to the tumultuous zeitgeist of the 2016 election and the subsequent inauguration of Donald Trump as president. So today, the Mothman is a very prominent cultural figure in Appalachia. He's got his own beer. He has his own IPA. Point Pleasant is home to an annual festival that draws over 10,000 people from around the globe, and it's home to the world's only Mothman museum. So Mothman's place within pop culture, and especially folklore pop culture, is quite solid. So since this, moving on from Mothman, since this is a study of identity, it's important to talk about what exactly identity is and how does it come about. So my approach grounds identity as being done through performativity, a notion which originated with Austin in 1962. So the famous, importantly, all utterances are performative actions in that they enact that which they describe. Butler argued that gender is also enacted through performativity and that it constitutes the very thing it performs. And this can be applied as well to other dimensions of identity, such as race and sexuality. Most importantly to this analysis is the notion from Buchholz and Hall that identity is not prediscursive, that is, it emerges through interaction. Also essential to this analysis is Crenshaw's intersectionality model. And I argue that, in fact, any analysis of queer Appalachian community practices necessitates an intersectional approach. This is because queer Appalachians are caught in the intersections of both queerphobia and anti-Appalachianism. That is, the lives of queer Appalachians and their experiences, our experiences, can't be captured by looking at just the ways in which we're affected by queerphobia or just the ways in which we're affected by anti-Appalachianism. And we experience in ways different than, say, straight or cisgender Appalachians or urban queer people. Again, as an example of this synthesized kind of antagonism towards queer Appalachians, see the sexually deviant hillbilly rapist from Deliverance. the most important thing I'm arguing in this project is that what we're seeing in the data is the real-time enregisterment of folkloric discourse, and the enregisterment of that discourse as being indexically linked to queerness, Appalachianness, and queer Appalachianness. Now, there's a precedent for thinking of discourse as having the potential to be enregistered as indexical of certain facets of identity. For example, Kramer 2013 found that residents from Louisville, Kentucky, which is a linguistic and cultural border zone, have access to multiple regional affiliations and therefore multiple discourses to draw upon in order to realize those affiliations. And that it may also be helpful to think of queer Appalachia social media communities as a sort of virtual border zone. I want to emphasize that this work is divergent in a lot of ways from traditional dialectological and variationist work, and that one, it's a multimodal analysis, and it's synthesizing both social media and folkloric discourse. It's also novel in that it centers queer Appalachians or Appalachian queers, and it begins with the rural and works from there outwards. As far as my methods, more specifically, this, like I said, it's a multimodal critical discourse analysis. It's based on Moran and Lee and some other visual psychology methods, but more or less it consisted of an iterative process of identifying, re-identifying, and taking notes on the written and visual content of the Instagram posts. This was done in 2 separate parallel processes, and they were labeled, categorized, reanalyzed, and grouped. In total, from the beginning of the account to when it was collected on December 18th, 2019, I collected 168 posts that had something to do with folklore. So just to talk a little bit about the data, from left to right, I have different iterations of Mothman as indexically something. So the first, the left with Mothman atop the Tudor's Biscuit World sign, you have Tudor's Biscuit World is an Appalachian eating institution. It's mostly confined to Central Appalachia. And you have Mothman here partaking in Tudor's, and you have presumably an Appalachian passerby in the car below emitting a heart as a sort of approval towards Tudor's, towards Mothman. So based on the context, you sort of get this Appalachianization of Mothman. He's being approved of by a passerby Appalachian. He's sitting atop Tudor's, he's eating a Tudor's biscuit. Effectively, Mothman is Appalachian in this picture. The middle picture, you have Rocky Horror Mothman, which is, aside from the title, it's obvious from the costume Mothman's wearing. He's got Dr. Frankenfurter's fishnets and other attire and pearl necklace from Rocky Horror Picture Show. And I'm pretty sure that the wing pattern here is the pansexual flag. So this image indexes and sort of enregisters Mothman as queer, as a queer icon. Following that, the final image is where Mothman is enregistered as queer and Appalachian simultaneously. So this picture depicts Mothman wearing jorts, cut-off jeans. They're ripped. He has on a bow tie with a plaid pattern. He has the Blue Ridge Mountain horizon on his wings, and he's in a field. And the caption reads, "Jort season is coming, 421." So first, this picture is quite clearly Appalachian based on the context. So you've got the Blue Ridge Mountains, a distinctly Appalachian geographical feature. The pattern on the bow tie is sort of reminiscent of a picnic blanket cloth, further associating Mothman with the rural. He's also in a field, and that's all great. But what's really interesting here is queer Appalachia's use of jorts in place of Daisy Dukes. So Daisy Dukes are named that because of the character of origin in the Dukes of Hazzard, and she was a woman. So she was a Southern woman as well. So you've got Mothman here in the Daisy Dukes and the bow tie and nothing else. And he's clearly overtly sexual. He kind of resembles a Chippendales dancer. And because he's wearing what might be assumed to be sort of women's clothing or in some way scandalous clothing, he's kind of overtly queer in this instance. Because he's basically a male stripper here. And that's sort of reinforced by the spelling of common using cum the slang for ejaculation. You've also got Daisy Dukes here, not just as queer because Mothman's wearing them, and if he is a man, he can presumably be gendered in some way. But on top of that, you've got the Daisy Dukes, or the Jorts, as being indexically Southern or rural. And traditionally, they might be associated with their show of origin, the Dukes of Hazzard, which has a lot of Confederate iconography, such as the Dixie, car horn, the General Lee, and the rebel flag atop the General Lee. But Jorts here is not necessarily indexical of anything to do with the Confederates, the Confederacy, or white supremacy. And I argue that this is intentional, given Queer Appalachia's inclusive and leftist approach to what it means to be queer Appalachian. And so what you see here is Mothman sort of emergent as an indexically queer and rural and Appalachian icon. So that brings me to my conclusions. So one thing I argue that this represents is how important and useful folkloric discourse is as a resource for queer and Appalachian identity work, and how these folklores and this folklore discourse is intersectional in nature, and that it defies the binary and reflects the lived and often contrastive realities of queer Appalachians. I think it also reinforces the versatility and really demonstrates the versatility and nuance of Crenshaw's model of intersectionality as a means to understand not just systems of oppression and marginalization, but also how intersectional identities are discursively and interactively created despite those systems of oppression and marginalization. Lastly, I also think this really highlights how the fluidity and freedom of folklore. I argue that in some ways Mothman and other folkloric subjects are discursive canvases where by talking about them, social norms and constraints are lessened. The imagination is pushed so far to imagine a flying moth person who wears jorts and is queer that doing the queer Appalachian work, reconciling those and unifying those isn't as difficult in comparison. Furthermore, I think this represents queer Appalachians' agency over their own narrative. And how it affords new possibilities for queer Appalachian ways of being beyond the normative, transgressing those boundaries. And most importantly, I think it demonstrates that the potential for change lies within our own communities as queer Appalachians, and doesn't necessarily need to come from any sort of outside agency or actors. And that brings me to my conclusion. So thank you.
Thank you, Brent. Next, we'll hear from Jarrett Hopewell.
All right, thank you. So my name is Jarrett Hopewell from the University of Montana. Today I'll be talking about conceptual animal metaphors in queer speech and how that relates to a queer dialectology. Just a quick trigger warning, this presentation does include graphic sexual language and profanity. So to start off with, what do all these animals have in common? We can tell that they're mammals and whatnot, but here, they all represent different types of queer community members. We have our bear, our otter, pig, pup or puppy, wolf, and cub. These animal metaphors are used as a medium for either self-identification or identification of other community members. This being based off of physical appearances, sexual behaviors, and also sub-community membership. It's also a tool for sexual communication in order to express things like sexual desires and erotic behavior. I think that people have kind of different varying views and understandings of what these animal metaphors mean, but for the sake of this presentation and research, here are some kind of basic general working definitions for each of these animal metaphors that I'll be focusing on. So a bear is an older, hairy individual with a large, stocky body. An otter is a hairy individual with a slim, slender body. A cub is a younger, hairy individual with a large, stocky body. A pup or puppy, it's an individual who enjoys role-playing as a puppy and typically assumes a submissive sexual role. A wolf is a muscular, lean, hairy individual who assumes a dominant sexual role typically. And a pig is an individual who wants to have sex all the time, typically dirty, kinky sex. We can understand these as conceptual metaphors. A conceptual metaphor refers to the understanding of an abstract concept in terms of a concrete source. So in this case, these different classifications and different categories of queer community members, those are our abstract concepts, and these are being understood in terms of animals. Just like other conceptual metaphors, these animal metaphors are common in everyday communication. They're systematic. They have a systematic relationship between dissimilar concepts, and they have a diachronic development. The biggest takeaways that I want to offer today are that the animal metaphors are systematic, complex, and worthy of future research in regards to a queer dialectology. And the implications of this research are that a queer dialectology would require a departure from traditional dialectology and a reconfiguration of modern dialectology. For example, starting off with data collection. So rather than doing questionnaires and surveys and norm interviews, this research utilizes multimedia platforms. So the research includes 250 public profiles from online dating apps such as Grindr, Growler, and Scruff. The criteria that I used to select the profiles was pretty small. Basically, I was looking out for typed out animal metaphors. I didn't consider fictional animals like unicorns and fairies, and I didn't consider pre-selected tribes. So a lot of these dating apps have the option when you're kind of building your profile to choose from different pre-selected animal metaphors. And I was mainly focused on what people were actually typing out. And then each of these apps have a special feature where you can randomly select different regions of the world, and I focused on the continental USA, finding profiles both in rural and in urban areas. So out of all the animal metaphors that I collected and found, the most common were bear, pup, pig, otter, wolf, and cub. So kind of going on to the complexity of these, I consider these complex because of the systematic patterns that are encoded and the systematic patterns of elements that are encoded within these animal metaphors. This includes things like the users and the identifiers of the animal metaphors, the relativity of age to the speaker, the constraints that are found in multiple animal identification, and then also the entailment of relationships and the use of additional kinship and hierarchical terminology. So these animal metaphors are traditionally associated with the gay male community. However, upon research here, it seemed that these animal metaphors are inclusive to individuals of various gender identities and sexualities, in addition to other ethnicities and ages. For the bear metaphor specifically, this metaphor is extended where different species can refer to a different person's ethnicity and age. For example, a panda bear can refer to somebody's Asian ethnicity, and a polar bear can refer to the white hair of an older bear. So diminutives, here I said that age is a little bit complex here. Some animals metaphors are the younger version of a different animal metaphor, and they tend to function as a diminutive. So from bear we get cub, from wolf, wolf pup, from pig, piglet. And there's no specific age, it seems like, on when you go from a cub to a bear. It's a little more complex than that, and it seems that it's relative to the individual. So this individual here in this top example, for them, it's once you get past the age of in your 30s, that's when you kind of go from the cub to the bear, it looks like, as they say, a 30-something cubbo. But these animal diminutives don't just include age or youngness. It can also be used to refer to somebody who's inexperienced or new to the community. So for example, this individual identifies as a piglet. They explain that they just come out after leading many years of a straight life and they're only looking for sex right now. It's very common for individuals to identify as more than one of these animal metaphors. We have like pup and bear, bear pup, pig bear, cubby pig. And there does seem to be a pattern to which animals compound with other ones. So it seems that a pig can compound with any animal. pup can compound with any animal except for wolf. And bear, cub, otter, and wolf don't tend to compound with one another. And of course, these are all generalizations. There's exceptions to all of these, but these are the general patterns. And one way to explain this is if we kind of dwindle down these elements into just small features, there does seem to be some contrastive elements here. So for example, wolf and pup contrast in that a wolf has a more dominant sexual role, but a pup has a more submissive sexual role. We just talked about the diminutive function and how bear and cub kind of contrast based off this older, younger, diminutive contrasting features. And then another contrasting feature is body type. So bear and cub share a similar body type, but these contrast with the body type of an otter, which is slim, and the body type of a wolf, which is more lean and muscular. And then last is partner entailment here. So wolf and pup, they may entail a relationship with at least one other partner. Just because you identify as a wolf and a pup does not necessarily and absolutely mean that you are entailed in a relationship, but it does have that possibility. And this can be further emphasized and specified through the use of these kinship type or hierarchical terminology, such as alpha, beta, gamma, and handler, owner, pack mate. For example, this individual here identifies as an alpha pup, and they give some insights on what that means. For them, that means they're looking for pack mates while also looking for a handler or owner there. So we've looked at some of these complex examples, and I just also want to share an issue that we find with this. So this specific token was taken from one individual's profile. It says, if you support 45, you're dead to me. Sorry, but he's a pontificating, he's a pig, a racist, egotistical, narcissistic, chauvinistic, pontificating pig. The only pigs that I like are the ones that have an aversion to latex. There's nothing better than hot, kinky, dirty sex with hot, raunchy pigs and taking a few rough readings. So the first thing that we see is that the metaphor of pig is used multiple times throughout both of these paragraphs. For those who didn't catch it, 45 does refer to the 45th and current US president. But even if you didn't know that, I think it's fair that we all can realize that the pigs in this paragraph don't necessarily mean the same thing as pigs in this paragraph here. We can understand that because of the different contextual clues, but also because of whom the pigs are referring to. They have different reference points, where pig in this paragraph refers to 45, and the pigs here syntactically refer to the ones that have an aversion to latex. And so kind of the question is, how are we able to conceptualize these differences? There's two metaphors that use here that are homophonous because they're using the same animal, but they have clearly different meanings. And the conceptual blending theory can be used to help kind of understand that. We can understand it as an extension of conceptual metaphor theory. It's a basic cognitive operation that we all have the capability of doing. And it blends concepts within a network of mental spaces in order to create new meaning. So in this instance here, this conceptual blending of a pig and 45, that the blend and the new meaning there, it differs from the conceptual blend of pig and the ones with an aversion to latex. Let's kind of look at what this visually kind of looks like. So with the first instance with 45 and pig, we have this input mental space of a pig. These are different elements that we may associate with a pig. On this side, we have the input mental space of 45 and these different elements here that at least the user and the writer of this paragraph associates with 45 here. In the process of the blending, there are correspondences between both of these input spaces, and these are condensed and compressed down into the blended space. And then there are different elements that are selectively projected from each of the input mental spaces into this blended space. So this user here and this writer of the paragraph is incorporating these different elements and selectively projecting them into this blended space. The use of the pig here, it's an insult, right? It's not something very nice. So the user and writer of this paragraph may also be including these other elements like rude, fat, and lazy from the pig input into the blended space to get this unique meaning behind 45 as a pig. Let's compare that though to the other paragraph here. So we have the same kind of input mental spaces from a pig, and then we have these other elements in the input mental space of I just wrote queer individual, but it's essentially the individual that this person is referring to, whoever that may be. And we have these different elements like kinky, promiscuous, and aversion to latex, which I'm summing up as just they. And again, we have these correspondences between these different inputs, and they are compressed down into the blended space. And then these different elements are selectively projected from the individual mental spaces into the blended space. Notice here that there's no elements that are selectively projected into this blended space, because this isn't, the use of pig here is not an insult in the same way that we understand this one to be. So elements like greedy, rude, fat, and lazy aren't projected into the blended space. And so here this creates its own unique meaning. So to kind of summarize here, these animal metaphors, they are complex. They're a medium for sexual communication, a tool for identification. They're not limited to homosexual cisgendered men. They do reflect interpersonal engagements, and they have a unique conceptualization, though they may be homophonous with some other conventional metaphors. And for all this, I say that they are worthy of future research, especially as it relates to queer dialectology. And so here are some implications for this research. It's to go beyond a traditional and modern dialectology. This research does show that it's complicated on what dialectology means for queer people. Sexuality and sexual roles typically aren't fronted in traditional dialect research. And in addition to that, the relation between metaphor and iconicity to sexuality. One of the interesting things that's not just represented by my research, but also by Brent's research, is the challenges of idea as a place. We can theorize that digital space and multimedia uses, they can be theorized as a place or a region themselves. And that's because we get this interference between regional language variations, these internet variations, and then queer variations, all in the same platform there. And so these are some things to look forward to when talking about a queer dialectology. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jarrett. If I can ask the other panelists to turn on their webcams, and then we can have the Q&A. So it looks like we're running about on time. Hopefully, as long as the webinar doesn't automatically shut off on the hour. This is the first one that I've actually moderated, so I'm not sure how the technology works completely at the moment. We should be able to hang around and get to all of the questions. So even if you have to leave, if you've asked a question in the Q&A chat, we will try to get around to answering it. And if you want to, you can watch the response later in the video recording. So let's start off with a question from Eris for Bryce. They said, I'd love to hear more. Did drag performers consider themselves more gay than non-drag gay people? Also, were all your performers AMAB or queens, or did you also have AFAB or kings?
You couldn't hear me before. Yeah, that's a great, those are great questions. So let me tackle this one at a time. I don't know that all drag performers consider themselves more gay or more queer than non-drag gay people. And anticipating a question that sort of comes out of that, I don't necessarily think that all drag performers would lump themselves together in terms of everyone's talking the same. Drag performers are very aware of variability within this particular community. I think that they are aware, however, of the sort of common archetypes or stereotypes that drag queens are excessive, are very queer, and that lots of queer and gay associated language is used by drag performers. I think that idea is there, but I would not go as far as to say that I think that all drag performers think that they're more gay or more queer. And to answer the latter question, there are both people who are assigned male at birth and assigned female at birth, and people who there's a lot of variability and gender identity as well. There were drag kings. Alexander was one who he's a king, and he was in the talk today. There's another drag king who was also recorded, and several who I talked with at there's no real venues in the neighborhood that I talked about that has a lot of drag king performances. However, down the street from this neighborhood is another bar or venue where it's almost exclusively drag kings, and I did hang out there quite a bit and talk to quite a few people there.
Thank you, Bryce. Just quickly, just a quick answer to a question from Marlo. Any of you that are looking at the history of Polari, this, not for this panel, but if you're interested or any of the other attendees are interested, hopefully the Committee on LGBTQ Issues and Linguistics, pending funding from a public history virtual programming grant, will be able to offer a webinar series on queer and trans language history sometime in the coming months. So thank you. The next question, well, let's do a Mothman question first to get range of speakers here. I'd love to hear more about Mothman and the Trump election. What is Mothman's supposed political orientation / force?
Yeah, so if it's the Mothman of queer Appalachia, then that Mothman is decidedly a cornbread communist. And you can look up the Manifesto for Cornbread Communism online. It's available for free. But about Mothman and the Trump election, so I had the privilege of going to the Mothman Festival in 2017. 2017. And they had a few speakers there, cryptozoologists who study things like Mothman, Bigfoot, and why they exist. Not maybe in the way we do, but in their own way. And as I understood it, they, because there was so much negativity, so much uncertainty in the air, Mothman had no choice but to appear, sort of, because he is this either harbinger of doom or he is attracted to bad goings on. That's how it was explained to me, at least.
Thank you, Brent. Let's see, let's take a question down here from Martin. Do you include study of gesture patterns in the drag community, assumedly addressed to Bryce?
So if you mean like the sort of more formalized and sophisticated study of gesture, then no, I don't think that I'm enough well-versed in that. However, if you mean, did I include maybe non-typical or non-linguistic means of communication, then yeah, I mean, there's lots of, John Rickford and, both Rickfords have written about the tooth suck and some other non-linguistic gestures or sounds in speech that predominantly in terms of African-American language and culture. But that actually is used regardless of race throughout this community. Tooth suck, tongue pop, clapping. There are lots of non-linguistic gestures that are used in this particular community of practice. They're included in the transcripts. They are written about or sort of talked about a bit, but not to any any way of elaborating on without embarrassing myself. So I will look into it more, and I think that's a very, very interesting question and one that that makes me think. So thank you.
You, Bryce. I want to give Jarrett a question, but I don't know if anyone else actually works on the research of metaphor. So it might be a bit unfair for me to ask you, Jarrett, but have you put any more thought into incorporate a multimodal analysis of animal emojis in your analysis of these animal metaphors?
Sorry, you kind of cut off real quick. Can you repeat that?
In your analysis of animal metaphors in the queer community, how are you going to incorporate a better analysis of animal emojis and what they contribute to those metaphors?
Yeah, definitely. I think the animal emoji use is really interesting. It does kind of show that the interference between, internet speech and regional speech there. I think that the animal emojis do offer some kind of image schematics metaphors to this. So that's probably something to look forward to, is how do they relate to offering this kind of image schematic section to these metaphors.
Great, thanks. I know we talked about that before. That might be a bit unfair to ask you, but yeah.
I could actually mention something about that Polari question. I didn't include it in the presentation, but I did take a look at the history of Polari, and as it relates to the diachronic development of these animal metaphors. So while the earliest record that I could find of like the term bear as we understand it today was published in the Atlantic in like the 1970s, I think. What Polari kind of shows in like the development from Polari shows that metaphorical use and kind of like using metaphors as like a code has been a development within the queer community.
Great, thank you. For those attendees still here, we're going to make our way through these last 6 questions, and if you have any additional questions beyond these 6, can get in contact with the panelists individually after the panel. Thank you. So from Mix James, I'm not sure how to pronounce that honorific. So about drag slang from a dance scholar from the ball scene, do these folks position themselves in relationship to the ball scene's cultural ownership? Mainstream drag is being monitored in examples such as a dip over a death drop, and which scenes they refuse to acknowledge. How is that related to your scope, Bryce?
Yeah, I think that's a very, that requires a very complicated but nuanced look at this kind of study. I think that the best answer I can give is that absolutely. I mean, these performers are most are well aware of the ballroom scene as a sort of origin in modern drag. There is, I mean, I didn't have enough time to talk about it today, but there is a really interesting sort of negotiation between Oklahoma City's drag scene is very often characterized as old school, and old school very often aligns with pageantry and showgirl type drag. And that is quite different from a club scene, lip sync performances at regularly booked gigs at some of these big venues. And that sort of negotiation clearly seems to have, at least subtly, influences from the sort of like Vegas showgirl type things and influences from drag ball culture. There's no doubt that the latter is a bigger influence and one which regularly goes without as much acknowledgement, particularly because of the spread and popularization of drag culture in things like RuPaul's Drag Race and in popular media. Drag ball culture is directly related to that. We can see the connection pretty easily. So yeah, drag performers are very aware of it, but I think that there is some sort of negotiations there, and it's certainly I don't think it's I don't think that you could make a claim that predict a pattern and who is going to be more likely to acknowledge it or not. But then again, maybe you are, and maybe I'll have to look into it. So that's my best answer for that.
Another question for Bryce. Did the performers talk about race at all, especially regarding origins of drag speech? Yes.
I think that question might have been asked before Giselle got to speak, because Giselle says it quite plainly that a lot of our language in the gay community comes from Black women, and I think Giselle's absolutely right. Actually, at another point in time, there's an interesting quote from Foxy in the discussion of white performers and the sort of like tendency for white gay cis men to say that they're really Black women on the inside, and Foxy makes the comment saying, as if she's speaking to them, yeah, I'm sure you know exactly what that's like. I'm sure you know exactly what that struggle is, sarcastically, of course. So yes, race is not something that people are not talking about, and it's certainly not something that should be left out of the discussion of any study of drag, in my personal opinion.
Thank you. Martin has 2 back-to-back questions for Bryce, so I'll pose them as a single question with 2 parts. Did you include study of gestures, and if so, were there distinctive patterns in the drag community? And did drag speech vary with context, example, in a predominantly hetero environment?
I think that we covered the gesture question.
Oh, did we?
And in relation to the second question, if I may, I think that I can answer this better if it's okay if we can also include Dominique's question.
Yes. Would you mind if I read it just for
please.
For the people listening but not watching? For Bryce, were any of your participants preparing for a performance in drag during your interviews? If they were, do you think it influenced your findings? I've just completely forgotten what those things are called. Them being sort of actively in a drag mindset, I guess.
Yeah. So, hi, Dominique, by the way. And in response to that question, and in adding to Martin's question, I think that yes, environment does matter, and yes, I did record people as they were getting into drag on more than one occasion. I will say though that you'd be surprised at how consistently the sort of patterns of behavior are. Certainly, as people are getting into drag, no one was ever alone, really. Especially when I was recording people as they were getting ready to go out and go do a show. So whether or not they were talking to me as the drag artist, there were always instances of the drag persona or the sort of like community member talking to someone else or talking to me in reference to someone else who could hear them. So there was actually some consistency of the sort of in and out of the drag character and in and out of the drag performer that absolutely involves some differences in linguistic realizations, one of which I just talked about last year at ADS in T release. So for example, Foxy at one point says, you know, I'm an entertainer. With 2 released T's there. But then at the end of the same segment where she says that, she says, but Foxy's just an entertainer. And so we see T release not happening as much there with when talking in third person about the character versus talking as the particular drag persona. There's some interesting stuff there. I'm still developing. I'm looking into that more specifically. In specific response to the question about more hetero environments, I did not record in any, so I can't speak to that. Almost everywhere we recorded was either in the community somewhere or at one of the drag performers' houses or at a sort of backstage area where we were chatting.
Thank you, Bryce. I just realized I accidentally moved a question for Jarrett over into the answered section from Stella, and then we'll end with Natasha's question to the panel as a whole. From Stella, Jarrett, why do you think animal metaphors are so widely used as opposed to other metaphors, such perhaps as food?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I don't think that my presentation showed any like food metaphors, but I think that as it relates to, you know, identifying a person, animal metaphors are much more common, not just in like a queer context, but just kind of in general. Animal metaphors are very common when trying to refer to another person. And whereas from my experience and my thoughts, food metaphors as they relate to kind of, you know, language used by queer people, it might refer more to like a body part or to something like that, rather than like the whole person themselves. And so my presentation was focusing more on the animal metaphors that refer to the identity of a person.
And if I can add, for food metaphors related to sex, those tend to be, and I know that was just an example, but those tend to be more related to an underlying metaphor of sexual appetite and sort of the objectivization of sexualized bodies. If I had to point you to on that, it would probably be Lakoff, I believe 1998, writing about sex metaphors and the logic of, in a paper on the logic of metaphorical logic of rape and how it underlies certain structures in society. From Natasha Rose, and this is where we'll end off. Hi, from the UK. I'm a first-year PhD student looking into the collective identity construction of the incel community, data from a forum. And I wanted to ask you all if you have any advice on how to make sure I do not lose focus of the QL aspect of my project when most people in the departments I am associated with are open, but none has any background in queer linguistics. Thank you in advance, and thank you for the super interesting presentations. Hart, thank you. Bryce, would you like to start?
I certainly can. I feel like I've talked probably too much for our poor listeners, but yeah, well, I think that certainly, I like to think of the development of queer linguistics in 3 phases. Typically, we talk about in 2, but I think about it in 3. The first being like, okay, so if we actually think about it, you know, queer identity and the way it relates to gender reveals that gender is so much more complicated than just a single label. Whatever that label may be. It's so much more complicated, and it is inevitably tied to other aspects of a person. Then that leads to sort of thinking, oh wait, you know, actually, straight people are doing just as much work to establish heterosexual identities and, you know, straight or cisgender gender identities. And that's really important. And that sort of leads us to this sort of more recent development within queer linguistics, namely in that identity must be tied to practice. I mean, of course, there's aspects of identity that exist up here, but for practical reasons, as linguists, we're never going to be able to really know a lot of that stuff. And secondly, what we care about is language, including textual language in a forum like yours. And so what we want to look at then is, how is language being used for a speaker or a typer or, you know, someone engaging with it to position themselves as someone able to engage in a conversation or engage in an interaction. It doesn't mean that there must always be evaluative language or there must always be attitudinal stuff. It just means that a person is always engaging with something other than themselves that reflects who they are in that situation, in that communicative situation, vis-a-vis language. And that, I think, is a really, really crucial part of the queer linguistic sort of perspective. I hope that helps.
Brent, would you like to go next?
I think Bryce did an excellent job. I mean, I think you put it way better than I could have.
Jarrett?
Yeah, I'm gonna say the same thing on that.
I would, from my own perspective, I would add, with queer linguistics, and the linguistics, you know, that usually has affixed to it any sort of marginalized community. So Black linguistics or Asian linguistics, right? The linguistics that comes from scholars from a particular community, especially marginalized communities, are at their core, to some extent, anti-disciplinary. It came up in a conversation a while ago when I was talking to someone about the interdisciplinarity of queer linguistics, and they said queer linguistics isn't interdisciplinary. And so the idea of queer linguistics, unfortunately to quite a few people in the field, is something that is auxiliary, if not ancillary, to the project of linguistics as a whole. So in terms of sort of keeping your work backgrounded or keeping it grounded in queer linguistics and not losing sight of that, in my experience, I think that's a continual process that everyone who takes part in queer linguistics, especially queer linguists, continually have to grapple with. Are there any queer linguist scholars of color you would like to magnify right now? I guess magnify, so in that sense, maybe give a shout out. So Dominique Canning at the University of Michigan, as well as Law Zimin at the University of California, Santa Barbara, will be joining Bryce and I on Tuesday for the Brazilian Linguistics Association's webinar panel on a queered science of language, contemporary perspectives. So please feel free to join us there. We have, I'm completely, DeAndre Miles Hercules at the University of California, Santa Barbara is also doing some fantastic work. Would anybody else like to add some?
Yeah, just want to shout out Katrina Daly Thompson. Their book, Popabawa, Tanzanian Talk, Global Misreadings, was super foundational to my Mothman research. And it's where I kind of began working with folklore, with social media, and sort of the intersections of queerness and other marginalized identities. So thank you, Dr. Thompson.
And in that line, I guess Jenny Davis from the University of Illinois around Champaign, I think that's right. Maybe Indiana, I don't know, it's an I state, somewhere in the middle of the United States. Her work on queer Native American identities has been incredibly influential for those of us here at the University of Kentucky. Jarrett, Bryce?
I'm glad that you mentioned all of our wonderful friends, but I have a pretty big list of references in my dissertation. I would encourage people, because how do I say this? I think because the sort of bridging of ratiolinguistics and queer linguistics is sort of happening right now, that a lot of resources for people interested in that intersection feel free to move beyond just what like is labeled as linguistics or sociolinguistics or ratiolinguistics. There's lots of stuff. There are lots of scholars of color who, and I would be happy to share some resources about on that. But there's lots of scholars of color who are working outside of just linguistics in ways that are really important for us as sociolinguists who want to make sure that we're moving in the direction we should be with our research.
Thank you. Jarrett, do you have any final shout outs you'd like to give?
There is one linguist, Renato Samardzic from, I believe it's the University of Oswald. They're in Poland. They've also done some work on conceptual metaphors and queer language, and they're kind of where I started with this research.
Thanks. And then I guess I'll end this off here with our obligatory comment, less than a question. The year's 2020 for posterity, and I think that Mothman is kind of sexy. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us. And if you would like to watch any part of the webinar or reference some of the slides, those materials will be made available later. And if you registered, you'll get a link for those after the webinar is ended. Thank you.